Welcome to the Smart Business Revolution.
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 You want a revolution?
You say you want a revolution?
Revolution. The revolution.
It's going on right now.
Welcome to The Revolution, the Smart Business Revolution podcast, where we ask today's most successful entrepreneurs to share the tools and strategies they use to build relationships and connections to grow their revenue. Now, your host for The Revolution, John Corcoran.
All right, welcome everyone. John Corcoran here. I'm the host of this show. And, those of you who have listened to this before, you know that we feature interesting, smart CEO founders and entrepreneurs for all kinds of companies. We've had Netflix, we've got Kinko's, YPO, EO, Activation Blizzard, Lending Tree. Go check out the archives. We've got all kinds of great interviews in there as well. And of course, this episode brought to you by my company, Rise 25, where we help B2B businesses to get clients, referrals, and strategic partnerships with Done For You Podcast and content marketing. And you can learn all about what we do at rise25.com. My guest here today, Jason Feifer. He's the editor-in-chief of Entrepreneur Magazine. He's also a podcast host, an author, keynote speaker, startup advisor, and just a nonstop optimism machine. That is literally in his bio. And he is truly optimistic about the future. He's also the host of the Build for Tomorrow podcast and author of the new book by the same name, Build for Tomorrow, an action plan for embracing change, adapting fast, and future-proofing your career. And Jason, such a pleasure to have you here today. And I want to start, I love talking to people about what they did, what they were like as a kid and how that shaped who they are today. You grew up in Florida. I love to ask people about, were they doing lemonade stands or things like that? You said you painted rocks? Yeah. Tell me about this rock painting business that...
Yeah. So the rock painting business wasn't that significant, I have to admit, but it was when you had asked me before we started recording for my first entrepreneurial venture, that was the thing that I came up with. So me and my friend Lauren, I don't know, we were maybe 10 or something. We grew up in suburban South Florida, and there are a lot of nice, smooth rocks. I'm sure they're not natural. They're trucked in from somewhere, but we just started taking them, painting them, and then trying to sell them door to door. And I don't know that we sold them anywhere past our own families, but I will tell you that as I've been thinking about this in the moment or two since I told you the rock thing, and now here we are actually recording, the most significant early thing that I did was that I started writing. In elementary school, I was making little comic books. Then I was starting to write short stories. By high school, I was actually writing for an audience. I had started writing for this local music magazine that I started finding in music stores called Ink 19. And that was really my very first significant experience writing for an audience, was going to ska shows and interviewing the musicians and then writing these reviews. And it made a big impact on me. The ability that I discovered by writing for this publication, that by writing, doors opened, that people let me into their shows and into their lives in some way. They sat down and talked to me simply because I was going to listen and then relay what they had to say. And that was an incredible power. For a long time in my career, in the early days, I came up with this line that I always said, which was that being a journalist means being able to talk to people you wouldn't normally talk to about things you wouldn't normally talk about. And that was an incredible power, particularly when I didn't know what I wanted to focus on. And it was like the keys to the kingdom.
I couldn't agree more. I did journalism in high school. I actually went to journalism camp during high school, which I joke, it's kind of like band camp, but nerdier.
Yeah.
And I loved it. I mean, it's so interesting to be able to talk to people and learn about them. It's also a very entrepreneurial career, especially these days. My father was a journalist his entire career, and you kind of have to go from gig to gig and network and get connections. And talk a little bit about how that shaped you, having to lead a career like that.
The very first things that I did in my career, I think about a lot because they remind me so much of what entrepreneurs have to do. I'll give you an example. The first job I ever took out of college was at a tiny little newspaper called the Gardner News in Gardner, Massachusetts, North Central Massachusetts. The paper at the time, 2000 and whatever this was, had a circulation of 6,000. I don't know what it is now, if it even exists. And I was so frustrated there because I had these big ambitions and I was not meeting them. I wasn't getting anywhere near them. And they were abstract at that time. I was 21, 22. I just knew that I wanted to write for a lot of people. And I wanted to do work that I thought was important. And writing about local middle school dances just didn't feel like that. And after about a year or so of getting very grumpy about this, I came to this realization. The realization was that I cannot wait for someone to come to me. Like, I can't just do a good job at this tiny little newspaper and expect the New York Times to read it and say, oh my God, this kid writing about the local middle school dance, we got to get that kid covering the White House. He's amazing. This is never going to happen, like never. So I needed to go to them. I needed to go to prove to people that I could work at their level, or at least that I had the ability to learn how to do that. And so what I did was I quit. I quit that job and I sat in my bedroom for 9 months in this tiny dumpy apartment next to a graveyard in rural central Massachusetts. And I started cold pitching editors. And the reason I did that was because I was just thinking, what actually does it mean to get myself in front of people who will not hire me? And so I thought, well, what's the lowest lift? The answer in my industry, at least, in the media, the industry that I occupied at the time, media, was freelancing. You can freelance, you can be functionally an independent contractor and try to pitch an individual story to an individual editor for an individual $500. And they will maybe take it. And that's how I really got my start. That's how I got into the Washington Post and into the Boston Globe and the Associated Press. And these very first building blocks of my career, it was all about not sitting around waiting for someone to come to me, but for me figuring out what it meant to go to them.
It's interesting. This is the 2000s when, Craigslist and newspapers are really being disrupted by the internet.
Yep.
Reflect back on how that has changed the industry that you are in journalism, and how publications need to be a little bit more scrappy and a lot different than the way they were 20 years ago.
Oh, it's radically changed it. And for the publications, I think the most important thing that publications have to wrap their heads around, which they're only very beginning to, is that the business cannot be monetizing content anymore. It just can't. And I hate the word content, but for lack of anything else. And the reason for that is because it's diminishing returns. You're fighting over a very small slice of a pie that is mostly being eaten by Google and Facebook. And the economics of it are basically churn out as much content as you can to just try to drive as many clicks as you can. And that doesn't lead to good material, which then just devalues your brand. And it's just a spiral downward. I believe that for a business like media to survive, it's going to have to think about what is the purpose of the thing that it has always been doing, and then how to build a model around that new purpose. So for me, I think that everybody in business should always be asking this question: what is it for? Literally in my book, Build for Tomorrow, I have it's like a blank page that just says in big letters, what is it for? So that you can tear it out and hang it on your wall, because it's the most important question that you can ask. And if in media, what is content for? Well, decades ago, it was for monetization. You run ads against it. You can sell subscriptions to it. Now it's for relationships. Full stop. That when you publish something, the people who read it feel good about you. They trust you. It's hard to monetize the content itself, but I think that once you build that relationship lasts a whole lot longer than the individual set of eyeballs on that individual article. Now the question is, what kind of products and services can you develop that people will pay you for because they trust you because of the content? That has to be the way that people think. And if it's not, I just don't think that there's a future for them.
So that's a really interesting point. Now, a couple of your stops along the way, you worked at Men's Health magazine, you worked at Boston Magazine, now at Entrepreneur, obviously. So are you saying that if it's Boston Magazine, maybe you are doing tours of Boston? If it's Men's Health magazine, maybe you're helping, your readers to be healthy in some way. If it's Entrepreneur, maybe it's events that bring entrepreneurs together and help them with their company beyond just the content that you produce. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So if you're Boston Magazine, I think that you should be doing tours, you should be doing local events, you should be the center of the community in that space, not just producing a magazine. The magazine is just the trust builder for this other business that addresses what is, frankly, at this point, a wider need and a bigger market. If you're Men's Health, you should, why is there not a national chain of Men's Health gyms? Wouldn't that make all the sense in the world?
Yeah.
Why does Men's Health not have a fitness or a weight loss consultancy? Why are people not feeling like they can get direct help from Men's Health? And similar with Entrepreneur, and these are the conversations that we're having now. We're starting to build it out. Can Entrepreneur help somebody grow their business? Like literally, can we provide a consultant? Can we be the place that helps people identify the franchise that's right for them and then help broker that relationship? What can we do to directly help people? I really, really firmly believe in the power of relationships more than the power of broadcast. And it's what I'm doing in my own, in addition to, these are sort of complementary, but in addition to editor-in-chief of Entrepreneur and all the work that I do with Entrepreneur, I have these things on the side that are just mine. So my own, social presence, my own newsletter.
Yeah, you've invested a lot of time and energy into it. I can tell you put a lot of content out there. Sorry to use that word again, but
no. I wish there was a better one. And the reason I don't like it, by the way, is just because it's widget. It just makes it sound like widgets. Yeah. People put months, years into producing something, and then it's just called content. Like it's next to like an AI driven piece of crap that tells you what time the Super Bowl is, and those can't be the same thing. Yeah. So, the center of the way that I produce my own stuff, and it's easier for me to do this as an individual than as an organization, a traditional media company, but is really relationship first. I'm producing constant content and ways for people to engage with me. Then they're going to reach out to me. Then I will respond to literally everybody, which then just locks in their feeling good about me for years. And now the question that I'm experimenting with and exploring is, well, what do you build on top of that? What's the service that I can provide that's actually going to be monetizable? There are things like speaking that I do a lot of, and that makes sense, but that's limited and doesn't scale as well. But I really, really believe that what people want and expect now because of the internet is direct connection and customization. And that comes by building off of relationships, not by just producing something and trying to distribute it to as many people as possible. That's still a business model, and Entrepreneur and every other media organization still has that at the very heart of it. And that content really, really matters. But I think that as we think about the future and what does it mean for a media company to exist 10, 20 years from now, this is how we have to start thinking.
It's an interesting point. I've heard others talk about this idea of customization, that all content will become much more customized to us, to the reader. How do you manage to do that without it becoming, AI written drivel, as you've said? How do we make it so much more customizable to the reader?
Well, so not every individual article needs to be customized. That doesn't make sense. And there's a reason why, mass entertainment is still basically a very passive experience. It's not because people haven't thought about like choose your own adventure or whatever. It's because sometimes people want a passive experience. They don't want to actually, they want to participate in some kind of sharing. And so you have to know the difference between what is basically like a resource or what is a providing of a service, be it entertainment or information. And what does it mean to be customized? When I talk about customization, what I'm talking about is that they want a custom experience. So being in touch with me directly, that's a custom experience. I can respond and react to them. Being involved in a community that I set up or that anybody else sets up so that you feel like you're in a space that was designed for you and you can have interactions that are going to be meaningful to you, that's also customization. But there's also, I am always in touch with my audience, and therefore I'm always building their questions, their curiosities, their insights into the things that I'm producing. That's customization. I just had just earlier today, we're talking, I do a weekly Instagram live on Entrepreneur's account. And sometimes it's just me answering questions from people. And sometimes it's me talking to somebody else. And today I happen to be talking to this psychotherapist named Catherine Morgan Schaffler, who wrote a book called The Perfectionist's Guide to Losing Control. And we started by talking about perfectionism and about reframing productivity, which is an interesting subject that she talks about. But at some point she mentioned balance. And I just watched the comments and suddenly everyone is like, balance. Everybody wants to talk about balance. So I just steered the conversation towards balance. And then that's what we ended up talking about for the majority of the time. And that was more meaningful to people because I could see in real time what they wanted to hear from us, because what were the pain points or what were the things that they were carrying around that she, with her particular area of expertise, was able to talk to. And so I abandoned plan and we just talked about balance. And that to me is also customization.
Yeah, definitely. And I would have to say a bit of a radical idea to traditional journalists, the son of the journalist. Kind of, there's a lot of traditional, dyed in the wool journalists who would say that it's about, we determine what the news is and we're going to go out and write it, and we're not going to be reactionary to what other people want. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. And let's be clear that there is an important distinction between important hard news and everything else. I am not in the important hard news business. I don't uncover things. I don't hold people to account. That is a role that press plays, and it's an important one. And we can debate how well it's executed. And certainly it doesn't, media doesn't get it right all the time. But in that case, I think that it is important for somebody to go out and report on the things that literally nobody is thinking about, but that we must know about. And I mean, it can be hard to get people to care about that stuff, but I think that that's important. And when you look at an organization that can do that really well at scale, be that the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, what you see is an organization that's increasingly diversified so that there are parts of the business that are more service oriented or more joy oriented that are going to bring in a lot of subscriptions and dollars. Like, I don't know the New York Times' finances, but I would imagine that their food products and their recipes and their games and whatever, these bring in a ton of people. And then that can help subsidize the important news that's produced that, advertisers may not want to run against a deep investigative reporting piece into something that's just very serious and sad, but that is important. So I think that if you have that mission at the core of your business, then you need to figure out basically how to do the things that are core to your mission, while at the same time making sure that you're also diversifying enough so that you have a thriving business. But then there are other parts of the media ecosystem, like what I occupy, where, my job is really to serve people. And so I don't see myself as a journalist anymore. I really see myself as an entrepreneur. I see myself as of my audience. And I see myself as having a bias, and that bias is just towards my audience. I have a bias towards my audience. I want them to succeed. And so that is a different thing. And I get that that's not going to make any sense to someone at the New York Times, but it's a different model and it's serving different purposes.
No, it's fascinating. I could talk about this all day. I didn't mean to hijack the conversation, just talk about the context here, but I do want to steer the conversation more towards your book. You got this great story that you talk about butter versus margarine and how the butter industry reacted to margarine when it came on the scene back in the 19th century. So tell us about that, and then we'll talk more broadly about the book.
Yeah. So the book is a book it's called Build for Tomorrow. And it's a book that's written for anyone who's going through change in their career or their lives. And what I offer are tactics and strategies and ways to reframe the experience to recognize the opportunity and find opportunity in this instead of being afraid of what's coming next. And one of the story, I love history. And the reason I love history is because the story has been told. Like, we know how the decisions that were made play out, which is different from what we're experiencing today, where you and I are making decisions about our own businesses and careers. And we don't really know how they're going to play out. We hope we know, but we don't really know how they're going to play out. But in history, we do. And so one of the stories that I tell in the book is about what happened to the butter industry. So in the 1800s, margarine was introduced to America. Margarine actually, it was not what you think of as margarine right now. Margarine was called oleomargarine, and it came out of France. It was originally an effort to provide the troops with a easy to travel source of protein. So basically, how could you create something that they could eat that wouldn't go spoiling immediately? And that was oleomargarine. And then it made its way over to America, and the butter industry just started freaking out about it. And they started to do this thing that industries do, which is called regulatory capture, which is basically they work with politicians to try to pass laws that favor their industry over their competition. And And so one of the things that they started to do, well, first they started to just tax the hell out of margarine. And then the next thing that they did was that they started passing these laws that mandated that margarine, which, again, I just also to be clear, margarine at the time, I said it's not like it was today. It's basically beef tallow at that point. Like it's it's like beef fat. It's not the thing that you think of now. That came later. But it's spreadable and it kind of functions like butter. And so anyway, they were having margarine dyed. Like states were passing laws that margarine had to be dyed weird colors, black, pink, these kind of unappealing things, so that the butter industry was claiming so that it wasn't confused with butter, but obviously it was to turn people off of margarine. And this actually went all the way up to the Supreme Court at the time, that ultimately struck this down and said you can't mandate that margarine be dyed random colors, but you can stop margarine from being dyed. So margarine couldn't be dyed yellow to look like butter. It was sold in its kind of white gelatinous looking substance, and it would come with powder that you would mix in to make it yellow. And anyway, the reason that this story is fascinating, aside from just the weird history of it, is that what ultimately happened was that margarine took off. And the reason it took off was because it was solving a problem that butter wasn't. Margarine was cheap. Butter was expensive. Margarine stayed, whereas butter got bad fast, because this is an age before refrigeration. So most people couldn't afford butter. And if they could afford butter, then their butter went bad very quickly. This was a problem, and people needed a solution, because we're talking about a mostly poor America, where people did not have enough money to buy the food that they needed to sustain themselves. And a lot of people just made their living off of stale bread and some cheap protein that they could spread on it. Margarine solved a problem for people. They needed it. And the butter industry, in seeing that, instead of trying to shift and solve that problem for people as well, just started to try to fight margarine. What could the butter industry have done? They could have maybe figured out how to improve their processes so that butter became cheaper. They could have invested in this nascent refrigeration technology and been a part of bringing refrigeration to the world, which, of course, once that happened, butter could last a lot longer. They could have done all sorts of things. They didn't. Instead, what they did is they fought it, and they made ridiculous decisions that ultimately just drew more interest to margarine. And then for margarine sales were much higher than butter sales. And that is what happens when you panic. When instead of trying to understand what people need and then evolving with them, you instead just try to hold on to whatever position you previously had. We all do some version of this. It is a terrible, critical mistake that businesses make. Do not be the butter industry of the late 1800s. Be the margarine.
You know, I know we're short on time, but there's so many modern parallels now to that story. I love that story. I mean, I think of like, Blockbuster versus Netflix and that whole fight, or I think about, like EV cars versus legacy automakers, or AI and how people are talking about regulating that, or crypto or something. Do you want to pick you don't need to take one of those. You want to pick one of those, a modern, parallel where you're seeing this unfold, a similar type of dynamic?
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, the literal parallel is the way in which the milk industry has tried to pass
nut
laws.
milks.
Pass laws saying that like the nut milks and the oat milks can't use the word milk, which is just outrageously stupid. Just incredibly, incredibly stupid. Because instead of doing that, what you should be doing is just figuring out how to be more relevant to your consumer. That's what should matter. But I'll tell you a story that it also reminds me of is, so you're familiar with the franchise edible arrangements?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So edible arrangements, for those who don't know, it's this franchise, and their kind of core product is
fruit in a basket, basically. It looks like flowers, right?
That's right. Yeah. Fruit in a basket that looks like flour. And so that company's been around for a long time. And the founder, who I interviewed a number of years ago, was telling me that there was this so the company was called Edible Arrangements, and then it just became known, and then they changed the name to just Edible. And then when California many years ago passed the nation's first cannabis law that decriminalized cannabis, the word edible was in there to refer to edibles, which almost everybody knows to be pot, cookies, and candies and whatever. But he had, the founder of Edible Arrangement, had never heard of that. And he saw it and he freaked out. And he thought, oh my God, I'm losing control of my brand name. Everyone's going to think of edibles as this thing. And he started he put together like it's like a kind of lobbying effort with expensive lawyers, trying to go state by state to try to stop people from using the word edible to refer to cannabis edibles. And which is, of course, a completely losing fight. I mean, it couldn't be a dumber thing to do with your time and money. And then at some point he said, somebody told him this. They were like, look, you need to, when something's coming at you, you need to decide, is this a, like, is this a, I'm trying to think of the word, like a tsunami. Is this like a tsunami wave that's going to crash down upon you, and that there's nothing you can do to stop it, and so you just need to run as fast as you can out of the way? Or is this a really nice surfable wave that you should grab your surfboard and try to ride? And, he thought about it, and he said, well, I guess I don't really know which one this is. And started to get to understand the cannabis industry, discovered CBD, which he had never heard of, realized that like moms are buying CBDs. And he's like, well, moms buy edible arrangements too. Maybe actually there's an opportunity for us in that space. And so he basically grabbed his surfboard and decided to ride it. He opened up a CBD store and has been experimenting with that ever since. And that is the smart way to be, right? He had a gut reaction. It was panic. I have in my book, the Build for Tomorrow, this kind of 4 stages of change: panic, adaptation, new normal, wouldn't go back. He was at panic, and that panic was causing him to try to hold on as much as possible to the thing that came before. And eventually what he realized was that the path forward was through adapting.
That's a great story. All right. I know we're almost out of time, so we'll wrap up with a question I love asking. I'm a big fan of gratitude. If you look around at your peers and contemporaries, others in your industry, however you want to define it, maybe it's other writer entrepreneurs like yourself. Who do you respect? Who do you admire? Who are people that you'd want to publicly call out and, thank them for what they're doing?
Oh my God. I mean, it's a very nice question. The list is so incredibly long. I've never had what some people would describe as a mentor to that. Like, I've never had like a singular person. Instead, what I've had is the great fortune to work with just an incredible number of really talented people who I've stayed in touch with over the years and have been a resource to them, and they've been a resource to me. And there's just sort of endless names from my time at Boston Magazine and Men's Health and Fast Company. But instead of naming like 7,000 people, I'll just say, I had mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that the first publication I wrote for was a publication, a music magazine in Florida, and the editor there, his name was, at least the editor who I was in touch with was named Julio Diaz, and Julio, he was just like a local guy who loves culture. I mean, he today is still basically a local culture writer in Florida. But he was the first person in any professional capacity to take my work seriously and to want to work with me and to publish my work and to encourage me to do more. And I wrote it was called Inc. 19. I don't think it exists anymore. I wrote for Inc. 19 for years, and I was always writing for Julio. And we're not really in touch anymore, but we're Facebook friends, so I see what he's up to. And that just meant a great deal, that somebody who was a few paces ahead of me said, you're young, you're raw, but you got something, and I will take you seriously. And that matters.
That is such a nice lesson. I really admire what you're doing, Jason. I look back on my career and I realize that there's these windows in time where, you have kind of the world is open in terms of opportunity for you. And, and they tend to come and go throughout your career. You might be up one day and the next you're down, And I love that you're leveraging it, taking advantage of it, building your personal brand. You know, when I was at the White House, we didn't have social media, but if we did, I would have tried to use it to, build my personal brand so that I could, have an impact at some point in the future, regardless of whether I hold that position in the future or not. And I think that's what's really interesting about what you're doing is you're doing both. You're honoring the company that you work for, and you're also, you're making your personal brand an extension of the values you stand for. Where can people go to learn more about you, connect with you, Jason, check out the book?
Yeah, I really appreciate that. So Build for Tomorrow is the name of the book, and it's available in audiobook. I narrate it myself, or ebook, or hardcover, and you can get that wherever you got your last book, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever. And I'd love for you to check it out. And then one other thing is that I write a newsletter called One Thing Better every week. I give you one way to improve, to build a career or company you love. And if you go to my website, jasonfeifer.com, just look up at the top, you'll see newsletter. And I would love if you subscribe and say hi.
And follow him on LinkedIn as well, because you put a lot of good content on there as well. So
I do indeed. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Jason.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Smart Business Revolution podcast with John Corcoran. Find out more at smartbusinessrevolution.com. And while you're there, sign up for our email list and join the revolution.
Revolution.
And be listening for the next episode of the Smart Business Revolution podcast.